But then just want to say, again, welcome to everybody. Thank you for taking some time out of your afternoon to join us to discuss polling. Thank you to Craig Newmark Philanthropies for supporting the American Press Institute's election work this year through the Trusted Elections Network, which is a group of 260 journalists and experts across the country focused on covering this election in a way that's driven by the information needs of audiences. We're so excited to have two folks from the AP here today. Julie Pace is the Associated Press's Washington Bureau Chief, and Emily Swanson is the Director of Public Opinion Research at the AP. Thank you both for joining us, and I will kick things over to you to get started with the conversation. If folks have questions as we go, just drop those in the chat. We'll have plenty of time to do a Q&A. Thanks again. Julie?
All right, thank you. And thanks to everybody for joining Emily and I today. A lot of what you'll probably hear from us today is versions of conversations that Emily and I have amongst ourselves and in our newsroom about polling, which is a pretty regular topic of conversation, particularly as we get to this phase of the election. And it's one that, both Emily and I have thought about a lot, just in terms of how we cover polling at the AP and how we do polling at the AP. And I think that one of the things that is, unique about us is that we do both. We extensively cover and write about polling and use it in our political coverage, but obviously we also conduct our own polls, not just about politics, and Emily will probably mention that a bit, but we do polling around a range of issues as well. And of course, we also have a tool called AP VoteCast, which I know Emily will get into more detail on, but this is something that we started in the 2018 elections. We'll be using it for the first time in the 2020 presidential election. And this is really a just incredibly exciting and sophisticated and really sprawling effort to look at the electorate in an election. Really notably, we'll be able to dig deep into not just who is voting and where in this election, but also who's not voting. And obviously in a close election, who's not voting is a really interesting part of the discussion as well. So we can get into some of the ways in which you can use that polling tool on the other side of this election. But obviously I know that there is a lot of interest in how you use polling in an election like the one that we're in right now. And I can talk about this really from a coverage perspective. We at AP have a pretty simple way of looking at polling from a coverage perspective. And that is, we think polling is really important, but we think it's one tool in our arsenal. It's not the only tool that we have. It's not the only data point. So we strive whenever possible to seek out multiple data points. That could mean that we're seeking multiple polls, that we're looking for trend lines, within a series of polls, maybe from different outlets, maybe over a different period of time. But it also means that we could be taking a poll and trying to then just do source reporting, inside campaigns, with political groups, with voters, going out to states and talking to people to try to make sure that what we're seeing anecdotally may be matching up with what we're seeing in polling data, or that what campaigns are telling us they are seeing in internal data or in their own focus groups is matching up with what we are seeing in polling data. We, of course, want to really be relying on polls that are credible. And I think, Emily and I have talked about this a bunch. There are a lot of polls out there these days. And I think it's really important to know that polls are not created equal. I often see journalists flagging polls from organizations that I've never heard of before, or I may, go to the little, writing at the bottom of the poll that talks about a margin of error that's particularly large, or a sample size that is particularly small. And so I do think, and Emily, can get into more specifics on this, but I do think it's helpful as you think about covering polls to think about, what are the couple of flags that you want to be looking for to make sure that this is a credible poll. And I think the other thing that you want to take note of is that just because a poll is overall credible, and you may be able to draw from it and use it in your reporting, doesn't mean that every piece of information within that poll is going to be usable. For example, it is really hard to get sample sizes that are large enough for certain slices of the electorate within a lot of the public polls that we see. This is why we're so excited about VoteCast coming out of the election, because it will really give us large enough sample sizes around a really diverse array of voters. For example, coming out of the 2018 midterms, we have a lot of data about Mormons. And that's fascinating because Mormons are actually a really interesting slice, both of religious voters, but also mostly conservative and Republican-leaning voters. And so we've been able to dig into a large sample size for those voters. As I talk about sometimes the standards that we use on polling, people will often say like, well, does that mean you can't use anything basically? Are you kind of ruling everything out? And I say, no, of course not. We have a lot of polls that we are able to use. And the way that we tend to use them in our coverage though is, again, as one data point and as a way to tell a broader story. So, and I would really encourage you to think about this as well as you think about coverage. What we really strive to avoid is stories that lead with the horse race, right? So one poll shows that Joe Biden has support among this percentage of voters and Trump has support among this percentage of voters. A lot of people will do that. That's okay, that's their decision, but the reason that we don't do that is because those polls are a real snapshot in time. And they may tell you something, a credible poll may tell you something about where the race is, at one moment. But it's not enough to really, I think, dictate, how you want to be looking at a race broadly. We have seen in this election, I think, some fairly remarkable stability. But we only can really tell that when we look at polls as a whole, when we look at them from the start of the general election to where we are now. And, as Emily and I talk about a lot, even within that stability, there is still a very real possibility that you could see instability in the final weeks. And so, you always have to kind of keep in mind that you're really just reflecting a snapshot. And that's why we want to make sure when we're communicating what's going on in those polls to readers, that we're making that abundantly clear by not overemphasizing the horse race. So what we do try to do is we really try to dig into what's underneath the horse race. What are voters saying about these candidates, about their personal characteristics? What are they saying about what is important to them in terms of issues? When I think back to 2016, there's a lot that people, pan about polls, but one thing that was abundantly clear, throughout that election is that polls showed that voters had really high levels of distrust and dislike for Hillary Clinton. And so it wasn't just that you saw Trump maybe overperform in some of these cases. He was running against a candidate who people clearly were telling us through polls that they didn't have a real natural affinity for. And that makes it less surprising that at the end of a race that someone would say, gosh, I really don't like that person. I'm going to give this person a chance. When you're actually digging into those characteristics, when you're actually looking at what's behind the overall support, you can sometimes really find interesting lessons in why people end up doing what they do. So I would really encourage people to be digging into those kind of characteristic questions right now. I also think one of the big things that you want to be doing with polls right now is looking at where voters are on key issues and which candidates they think are best at handling those issues. We have seen that President Trump polls fairly well and has consistently polled fairly well around the economy, for much of his presidency. He is not polling particularly well around handling of coronavirus or handling of racial tensions in this country. If those are the issues that voters are saying are top of mind for them, and he's not polling particularly well around that, that gives you something to really dig into, in terms of the dynamics of this race. So I think, again, even when we talk about not leaning into the horse race, there's a lot that you can dig into to write rich and contextual stories about all of this. The last thing I would just sort of say, again, kind of pivoting to VoteCast, is that we will get through this election eventually at some point. We'll see when we actually are able to call this race. But I do think that one of the ways in which that you'll be able to use VoteCast, that we'll be able to use VoteCast, is to really paint a picture of what this country looked like on election day. Who voted where, why they were voting, what issues were at the forefront. And ultimately, for all of the discussion that we all have, about the horse race and about the who's up and who's down, this is an election that comes down to voters. And particularly for those of you, who are in local newsrooms, I just think that's a really rich resource. We'll have data from every state. It's a really rich resource to really be able to dig into, what was motivating voters in your area. And I think, depending on the way that this election goes, give you a lot to report on about what your communities will look like for the next year or 4 years. And with that, I can hand it over to Emily.
Yeah, so as Julie sort of talked about, and I'll speak a little bit more broadly to this and then dive into what we're doing with VoteCast. A lot of my mandate as AP's polling director is to explain how the American public is feeling at any given time, and in terms of VoteCast and elections, how American voters are feeling in the hows and whys of an election. So a lot of AP's polling work is sort of takes a little bit of a step back. We might ask who you're voting for, but what we really want to know is what people's positions are on the issues, how they're feeling about the state of our country, our democracy, how they're feeling about their neighbors and fellow voters, what experiences they're having, either in general or leading up to an election. Sometimes those are things that could be tied to voting behavior. Other times, polling isn't limited to just elections. We're also talking about all sorts of other opinions and experiences that Americans might have. Actually, an example of this is that we've done some polling with API on Americans' relationship with the news, and how and why they consume news, and whether they pay for news. Many of them don't, but those who are, why are they doing it? And VoteCast broadly falls into that bucket of explaining the how and why, and in particular, how and why of an election. On election night and or quite possibly in the weeks to come, when we're looking back, why did whoever won in the presidential race, in a given Senate race, in a given governor's race, what was the appeal of that person? Which groups powered them to election? Which groups impacted the election by staying home, and why did they do it? Traditionally, much of that role has been played for the AP by exit polls. And VoteCast was developed in part because of the changing way in which Americans were already voting. In 2016 and 2018, more than 40% of people who voted either before Election Day early or voted by mail. So we were already seeing this changing way in which Americans voted that made it very difficult to capture an accurate representative portrait of the American electorate by standing outside of polling places, like in a traditional exit poll. And so we developed this new methodology, which does away entirely for us with the idea of in-person exit polling, to replace that, but also to still allow us that kind of depth and explanatory power. As a result, what we are doing is a super in-depth survey of about 140,000 registered voters this fall, and including both those who are voting and aren't voting. So that actually allows us to expand who our target is. We started doing this in 2018, and something that we discovered when we did it then is that we actually really accurately captured the way in which Americans were voting across states, which is something was already very important to us and has turned out to be even more important to us this year as we are experiencing a truly unprecedented election in terms of how people are going to be voting. It's going to wildly accelerate the trends that we were already seeing. So that, and that survey, for example, if you tell us you're not voting, we ask you why. We find out who you are. We find out who you would have voted for. a really interesting thing that we found out in 2018 was, for all of the talk about turning out more voters, one of the real challenges for any candidate who's going to want to turn out more voters is that the majority of those who don't vote are just a lot less interested in voting, which makes those strategies very challenging. But we also are able to go into, as Julie mentioned, very great depth, both at the state level and at the national level, at how different groups voted. At the national level, sometimes in very, very fine detail. Julie mentioned Mormons, but other smaller religious groups, smaller racial and ethnic groups we'll be able to talk about that we've never been able to talk about before in the context of elections using high quality data. So we're really excited about that. We're really excited about how it turned out for us in 2018, and as I mentioned, the pandemic has just made it an even more important tool in our arsenal, both for helping inform our decisions on the AP decision desk, but also really even more importantly in the years, but weeks and months to come, what happened when we're looking back at the election. Can probably just open it up to questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for kicking us off with that. If folks do have questions, please drop those in the chat and we will get to them. But I will start with kind of a bit of a technical question and sort of what we've learned over the past 4 years. So, I know when I talk with reporters and see comments on social media and websites, news websites is, oh, the polling was wrong in 2016. So just curious, how would you respond to that overall statement? What may have been a bit off about polling in 2016? What things have changed? Whether that's weighting different groups in terms of predicting who turns out to vote, and then how have you found communicating about if we look at polling aggregators, what do these statistical probabilities of win chance or whatever, what does that actually convey? How can we kind of clearly break that down to audiences? So there's a lot of questions in there, and happy to have either you take those and break those up how you see fit.
Emily, why don't you start off with some of the 2016, because again, we've talked about this a lot.
Yeah, I'm happy to take the question. So 2016, the way in which it has impacted people's confidence in polling, I think there are things that we can look back at that are actually quite reassuring. However, there are a lot of lessons that we can take from 2016 about how we should look at polling. And it's something, frankly, that informed some of the codification of what Julie already talked about in terms of our own strategy towards horse race polling. So in 2016, the impression a lot of people have is that the polls were just way wrong. Hillary Clinton led all through the election, and then we come to election day and Donald Trump emerges victorious. That is partially true, but it's also partially false. The national averages of polls taken in the last couple weeks of the campaign, Hillary Clinton led by about 3 percentage points. She won the national popular vote by about 2 percentage points. So there's a little bit of an error there. It's normal for polls to have that kind of magnitude of error, but it actually wasn't a huge error nationally. There were a couple of things that happened. One is that in those final 2 weeks, it seems that undecided voters and people who had been saying either I'm not going to vote or I'm going to vote for the libertarian candidate or I'm just not sure, broke dramatically in Donald Trump's direction. They were by and large Republican-leaning voters who had been hesitant about saying that they were going to vote for him because he was a deeply unpopular person. And they came back to him in the final weeks of the campaign. people's perceptions that Hillary Clinton had that election in the bag were already baked in. And that, to me, has been one of the main lessons to learn from that. Don't bake in that one candidate has the election in the bag. Those polls that are taken in the final 2 weeks of the campaign, they matter. They matter more than what the polls show now by a lot, and things can change. The other thing that happened, of course, is this Electoral College popular vote split, which made it easier. It made it more difficult to learn, of course, who was going to win the election based on those national polls. But another thing that did happen is that some of the polls in those battleground states were a little bit more off. The polls in Wisconsin were off. The polls in Michigan were off. The polls in Pennsylvania were off. And those were, of course, the states that put Donald Trump over the top. There are a variety of reasons that people have looked into for that. One is, I think that Andrew alluded to, polls not properly accounting for the education of the electorate. Different people respond to different polls, respond to polls at different rates. Middle class, older white people who have college degrees, no problem representing them properly in polls. People who are lower income, people who are working multiple jobs, people who are Black or Hispanic, people who have less education, all are more difficult to get represented in polls when you just make those original calls or however you happen to be contacting them. Most polls correct for this. My opinion is that all polls need to be correcting for this. Not every poll in 2016 was correcting for education as it pertains to that. And as we all know, in particular, white voters without a college degree went so dramatically for Donald Trump that not properly representing those people and the percentage of the population that they made up, especially in those states, may have been a key factor here. Another thing that happened is that in those final couple weeks of the campaign, there weren't a ton of polls in some of these states, in Wisconsin, in Michigan in particular. One reason for that is that in the, say, 3 or 4 weeks before the campaign, before the election window, some of the large leads in the polls from Hillary Clinton, which are, you know, I'm having deja vu moments right now, led folks to be interested in doing more polls of states that could be battlegrounds in landslide elections instead of the states that were most likely to change a close election. Everybody kind of thought those states are in the bag. And when those final undecided voters came around to Donald Trump, that was something that was missing. It seems to some extent like that has been corrected this time around. I'm seeing no shortage of polls in Wisconsin, for example. Still, it seems like there are maybe some folks who are hesitant to poll in Michigan, who are doing state polls, although we've still seen more of those this time around than last time around. I'm certainly hoping, I wish I had the budget to do state polling, but certainly hoping that folks who do have the budget to do state polling are going to do a little bit more of that this time around. But as I said, the lesson of that, more so than the polls were all wrong, was that national polls are pretty good. Some of the state polls maybe be a little bit more hesitant about, and don't let what is happening in the polls right now predetermine what you think is going to happen in November.
I mean, here's a classic example. Right as we got on to this call, I don't know if you've even seen this yet, Emily, but Quinnipiac has a couple of state polls that they just dropped, including one that has Biden up 11 points in Florida. 11 points in Florida is like a massive, historic, in modern history kind of lead. We're not going to take our eye off of Florida and stop reporting about what's happening on the ground in Florida because a poll shows that Biden's got an 11-point lead. Like, Florida's a super close and super important state, right? And that poll could just be an outlier, even though it's from a pretty good pollster. So, these polls, and I'm sure you're going to see a ton of coverage of that 11-point Florida lead today. I think you want to kind of look at it in context. Like, is that in line with other polls that have come out? Is that an outlier? Is there something that could be impacting the way that voters are just right now in this very moment over the last 4 days or however long they were in the field impacting that? And do we see in a week or two that things start to normalize a little bit? Because you do kind of see these sort of really eye-catching, numbers that pop up. The other thing I would just say quickly is that, all of these polls are also, based on a model, an expected model of the electorate, who you're expecting to turn out here. And so that's why I think in VoteCast, the who doesn't turn out is so important. If Biden is doing really well in polls because it's looking like he's stronger with seniors, for example, which it does look like he is right now, but seniors don't actually show up in as high of numbers as we expect them to normally show up because maybe they don't want to show up to vote in the pandemic. Maybe they don't want to do mail vote and then they didn't show up, because cases were high, in their community. That will change the outcome of the actual election and make it perhaps look different than how some of the polling looks. So again, it's why you want to take the polls into account, but not sort of over rely on them as a predictive tool.
Excellent. Thank you both for those answers. Diving a little bit deeper into that, Julie, you just mentioned the example about trends in older voters potentially. You talked about the example in 2016 of like in the underlying data. Actually, Secretary Clinton was pretty unpopular, relatively speaking. So late breaking voters breaking a different way was maybe not surprising. Are there other things that either of you are seeing in the data this year that suggest some other factors that might play a role, whether that's the age of voters or just other groups that are having interesting movement this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think Emily should jump in on this too. I mean, I think a couple of things that we are certainly watching for is I think older voters will be really fascinating. To see, there's a lot of reporting being done around older voters right now. Older voters are living in a year where they have a lot of very personal, health considerations that they are dealing with right now and how that potentially sways the vote. One dynamic that we see in polls that is very different from 2016 is that you don't have two candidates who are both pretty unpopular personally with voters. Biden tends to be viewed just more favorably among a higher percentage of voters. So how does that factor into this? Those voters that Emily talked about who at the very end were kind of swayed and, maybe they were independents, or moderate Republicans, and they eventually went back home to Trump at the end, in part, and having talked to some of those voters just because they just didn't like Hillary Clinton. How much does the personal characteristic element of this, sway what they might or might not do at the end? I think that's a big thing, that we want to look at here. And then the other thing, though, that, we comment on a lot, Emily and I, is there is one thing that has been really consistent in our polling over the last couple of years, and that is Trump's approval rating. His margins on that approval rating bounce up and down between how many percentage points, Emily?
Been within about a 10-point margin, which sounds like a lot, but is historically wildly narrow.
He just doesn't bounce up and down, with events. And so it's why, he has this base that is just incredibly reliable. And, it becomes a little bit of a joke in a newsroom, like, go out and do a story on whether Trump's voters are, changing their opinions of him because of this massive seismic event that has happened. And no, they don't. He has a very loyal base. That could mean that that's all he has on election day, right? And he loses because he could never expand it. or it could mean that he wins because that base is definitely going to show up because they're incredibly enthusiastic about him, and he gets just enough of, you know, the group that is not, you know, dyed in the wool of Trump supporters, and he pulls it out. But I think you can't underestimate or forget about just how solid his base has been throughout this last 3.5, 4 years.
Yeah, that the difference in enthusiasm between the supporters of the two candidates and the sort of attempts to gain breadth of support by Biden versus the depth of support for Trump within his base is going to be, I mean, it's going to be the most important dynamic of this election. There's no question that Trump's supporters are motivated much more by support for him than Biden's are by support for Biden. On the other hand, Biden's supporters are really motivated by being really scared of 4 more years of Donald Trump. The other thing that I would mention here is this fairly new distinction in terms of how people are going to be voting. This is something that has played out in different ways in different states in previous years as well, with sometimes Democrats being a little bit more likely to use early voting, historically mail voting, in part because it leans older, has been somewhat more Republican. We really expect that to change this time around, both because of the virus driving more people to vote by mail, but also some of the rhetoric around vote by mail by Trump in particular and Republicans in general, casting doubt on that process. And so we expect probably pretty massive margins for Biden among vote by mail voters nationwide, and then probably for Trump supporters to really show up on election day. How that plays out will, and who actually shows up, who actually sends in their mail ballot will make such a huge difference this election. And it's going to make for a really, really interesting election night because of the way those votes aren't all heaped into one pile and then counted together. You're going to see patterns in terms of the way votes come in that we've never really seen before across most of the country.
One quick follow-up on that, because I think that's a pretty crucial point in looking at polling data. When polls, try and identify like who are likely voters, what's the shape of the electorate this year, is any of that dynamic accounted for in the sense that you're looking at, we can already see in certain states that have started getting back class of mail ballots of rejection rates that are maybe not evenly distributed across the electorate. Is that something that polling even tries to account for, or is that just, here's who we think are the likely voters, and their troubles voting are a separate issue?
Usually, some polls have ways of taking into account sort of whose ballot has already been returned. You might know that depending on the state. If you're doing a poll from the voter file and are talking to the person who is on the voter file. Those are relatively rare polls that do that. But I think, for example, the New York Times Siena College polls maybe take that into account. For the most part, I would say no, polls aren't taking into account the rejection rate. That said, this is something that it's not quite brand new all across the country. There are already some states that, 5 states that were more or less all vote by mail before the pandemic. And you don't see necessarily large polling errors or larger than usual polling errors in those states. But it essentially is a very difficult to account for thing in polling. If somebody voted and thinks they voted already and their ballot has not been counted, that's something that we can't really take into account.
Thank you for that. Just as at a high level, thinking about all these different pollsters, if I'm a local reporter and I don't have time necessarily to review every single credible poll or pollster, what are some things that I should look for in a poll to determine whether this is a quality poll, whether this is credible, whether I should even write a story about this or about a collection of polls?
Emily, why don't you take that one?
Sure. So broadly speaking, this is unfortunately a very difficult question for a person who's kind of a polling layperson to sort out. But what you're trying to figure out is why should I believe that this poll is representative of who it says it's representing? The very first thing that you should look for is, have they told me how they are conducting this poll? A lot of polls actually don't. The traditional way in which this sort of thing has been reported is, 10 years ago, you could get away with this poll was conducted by phone. It was conducted among X number of adults, registered voters, likely voters, whatever you're doing, and this is the margin of error, and these are the dates. You need more than that. You need to know who was called if they made phone calls, or how was the sample selected if it was online. Just online isn't going to cut it. What we are looking for is a random sample. Not all polls are conducted using a random sample these days. We still look for a random sample as the base of our polling. If the poll is conducted by phone, it must include both landlines and cell phones. And ideally, they tell us what the percentage of cell phones is, and it's quite high. Some pollsters are doing upwards of 80% cell phones at this point. More than 50%, I think it's creeping up towards 60% of Americans only have cell phones these days. And most of the rest are either a mix or cell mostly, have a landline but don't usually use it. And then we are looking for, has this poll made adjustments to make sure that it represents accurately the age, race, sex, education levels in particular? I would say those are probably the top things that we're looking for of the electorate.
And I would also say quickly, this probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways, you don't want to use partisan polling. You don't want things put out by advocacy groups or by political parties. There's a lot of that out there that sometimes is very obvious. And then there's some out there that also isn't very obvious. And so you might have to do a little bit of digging around that too.
It's a funny thing because for a lot of you who are reporters, you're probably talking to some of these pollsters and they're really smart people. They're not doing bad polling. But the data that they are putting out is trying to spin you, almost certainly. They're putting it out there for a reason. If it's their sort of standard internal polling, they're likely putting out only the best numbers for their candidate, unless they're fundraising, in which it might be the closest numbers for their candidate. And then there are other polls that are sort of conducted specifically with the idea of ginning up a certain message and might use coded language and stuff like that.
Great. Just a quick follow-up, I think, on that from someone in the audience. When you say a poll should accurately represent age, race, sex, and education levels, what's the benchmark to compare them against? Is it voter registration, expected turnout, census, prior election, some combination? What does that look like?
So what my opinion is that the best way of doing this is to wait, or let's just make adjustments to the census data either for adults, if that's the population that you're trying to represent, or registered voters, if you are looking at a population of voters. The reason I say registered voters as opposed to likely voters is that our benchmarks for weighting are much better for registered voters than for likely voters, based both on information that's from the voter file or from the Census Bureau, which every 2 years does do a survey of registered voters as part of the current population survey. Depending on exactly which characteristic you're looking at, one or the other of those might be a little better. I think the voter file is better for age, for example, and the census is much better on education. But that's my feeling, that most polls are not weighting to, most polls that I find to be highest quality are not weighting to a pre-existing assumption about what the likely voter population is looking like. They're weighting to benchmarks among registered voters and then screening in some way for likelihood to vote. That could be based on self-report. It could be based on previous vote history. I think the best polls usually often do some combination of the two, so that your professed intention to vote is maybe bumped up a little higher if you have voted previously than if you haven't. There's no one way of doing this, but that is my opinion about the best way to make those adjustments. Thanks.
So looking at some of the research that you've done this year, are there any particular issues that are standing out to voters that maybe reporters should be paying closer attention to, or covering in greater detail, or just anything else that's something that could be good threads for reporting for local folks?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I don't think any of these will come as huge surprises to most people, but certainly, coronavirus, the pandemic, has really kind of taken over in a lot of ways. We've seen just really high voter concern about that. Some changes around that, as the year has gone on, but still it remains, a top issue for people. And, when it comes to the candidates, Trump has generally been viewed by voters, in a negative light in terms of his handling of the pandemic. Obviously, you can't have a direct comparison there to Biden because Biden's not in office right now, so you could really only look at Trump. But we've also seen, particularly through the summer, a lot of voter concern around police brutality, racial injustice in policing, which was really pretty fascinating. And then the economy, this to me is like one of the really interesting areas in this election because of what I said earlier, where you both have an economy that just took an incredible hit, when the pandemic took hold. You've seen some growth over the summer, but you're kind of heading toward the end of the year with deep concerns about, where the economy could go if there's not more government money plunged into it, and it looks like there's not going to be before the election. And then you've got Trump, who sort of has hung, with a fairly stable for Trump approval rating. It was a little bit of a dip around the economy, but this remains his best number. And so, where that goes over the next month, I mean, if you think about the way that the news has changed over the last 2 weeks, like what could potentially be happening on the economy. Jerome Powell was pretty dire in his comments this week about it. How that would have then potentially affect Trump on his top issue, I think, is definitely something that we're going to be focusing on.
Cool. As kind of a complement to that question, from your perspectives, are there questions that that polling can't answer that you'd like to see reporting due to complement the data that you're getting in polls? The one that I get most often that I wish that I could answer and can't before the election is that question of who's going to show up. It's something that is
tremendously difficult and to determine, you know, where turnout is going to go among various key groups, especially when you're talking about differences of a point or two in turnout, completely changing the outcome of an election. If you're looking at, for example, just pretend for a moment that every group in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan votes in exactly the same way that they did in 2016, but there's a 2-point increase among one Democratic-leaning group. That would completely change things, and it's completely outside of the margin of error of most polls to be able to measure, and is just insanely difficult. And it's a question that every reporter would like to know from me, and that I do not know the answer to and can't help them with.
And then the other one that we'll want to know from her after the election that also drives Emily crazy is when we ask, you know, why did this group vote this way? Because the answer is there's not, you know, one clear reason usually. You know, we always want to be able to draw a causation and say this group voted this way because of X. And, you know, that's not really possible in polling. And that's where I think, you know, when I talked at the start about using polling as one piece, you know, one tool in your arsenal here, in your toolkit, like you can see that a group of voters did vote a certain way. And then you just got to go out and talk to them, right? There's sort of no like replication. You know, you can't use polling, you know, to replicate just that kind of reporting. So you can use it to sort of point you in directions and point you toward, you know, who the key voting blocks may have been and in what places. But then you go and you talk to people. And I have always found this, you know, as a reporter, sometimes you have sort of an assumption about why, you know, white, highly educated women must have voted this way because, and then you go out and talk to some of them and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that issue, right? Or there's just something very personal in their lives that affected their vote. So we always want to know, like, what is the reason? What is the thing? And that just takes a lot more than the polling can really tell us.
Great, thank you. Just for folks listening, we have about 10 minutes left, so if you have questions, make sure to drop those in the chat. We have time for a few more, so we can get to them. One question just popped up. Do you consider non-probability polling, like that used by Survey USA, to be reputable? Would it meet your standard to report it on?
So at AP, we do not report on the results of non-probability polls. Those tend to be, and I think Survey USA does this partially, and they partially use robopolls, which we don't use for different reasons. So I'll maybe talk a little bit about both of those. Non-probability polls tend to be conducted using online panels that are recruited using internet advertising. So they are not starting out with a random sample of the electorate. And we, our opinion is that there are theoretical ways in which one can get good data out of those panels, or relatively good data out of those panels. But that for the most part, you know, starting with a random sample is the best way to go, and that we frankly don't get enough detail from those who conduct polls using those panels to convince us of exactly why should I trust that you have made the proper corrections in your data to make sure that we trust that it's representative of the general public. With polls conducted using what's called interactive voice response, IVR, or it's more commonly known among lay people as robopolling. We also stay away from those. One reason for that is that even compared with other phone polling, which response rates have been down in recent years, the response rates to those are really, 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 really tiny. They also can't legally call cell phones, which is why for a Survey USA, they add a non-probability online panel component to that, we usually just don't get the disclosure to figure out why I should trust that this sample that starts out with something that is a non-random non-random sample.
Emily, you just muted.
I muted myself. What should convince me that this is now a representative sample?
Got it. Thank you. And John asked a follow up to that, and you touched on this a little bit, and we can pull some of these out. But do you have a checklist of what a pollster needs to provide in order for you to report on it and consider it credible? And if so, is that something that you could share with us? Or if there are examples of things that you've seen that could be useful primers that we can share out, because we'll email everybody after the call with a recap. So if you have resources around that, that would be great.
Yeah, we discuss a lot of this, although not all of it in the AP style book. There are so many ways of conducting polling that it's really difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all checklist. However, in general, we still do need the population that you are attempting to survey, how you reached them in terms of like the mode of contact, along with how they were selected to take part. Was it random digit dialing? Was it random selection from a voter list? Was it from a non-probability panel? We need the dates that the poll was conducted. We need an estimate of error. And we need details of how the poll was weighted and why for any poll, why we should believe that it is representative of the public, because even starting with a random sample, that doesn't completely do it. I'm probably missing something there off the top of my head, but those are the basics in general. It's not necessarily a matter of just you send it and that means you're in, but that's sort of the basic level of disclosure that we expect. Oh, also wording and order of questions. That's one that I missed.
Awesome, thank you for that. Got time for, I think, a couple more questions. Oh, no, I'll get to John. John Frank's got lots of good follow-ups. Appreciate that, John. Given the margin of error is a plus minus, how do you handle that in writing? If a poll has a margin of error of plus or minus 5 percentage points, that's a 9-point gap. Do you say that's within the margins or too close to call? John says, sorry, I love polling. Love to see it, John.
No need to apologize for that, John. Yeah, so we have a pretty clear set of rules for that at AP. If a poll, whether it's the margin between two candidates or whether it is, the difference between an approval or disapproval or a change in approval or the percentage who favor, policy X, if it is within the margin of error, we describe that as close, about tied, about even. That's the type of language that we use. If it is at least one margin of error, we might describe that as a slight lead or a slight change, or what is a little bit more statistically accurate, an apparent lead or an apparent change. The reason why we do that even when it's over the margin of error is that the margin of error applies to both answers. So the easiest example here is the margin of error applies to both Donald Trump and to Joe Biden separately. And so we actually need two margins of error to describe as a lead or a change without any qualifiers. That is language that we have held ourselves to in order to properly convey the amount of statistical certainty we have in what we're saying.
Great, thank you for that. Got time for maybe one or two more questions. one thing that we've heard quite a bit about in recent days and weeks, and potentially maybe give outsized focus to, is the notion of undecided voters. So I'm curious, how AP, in a constellation of definitions, how AP defines and thinks about undecided reporters, and or undecided voters, excuse me, and what does that look like in your coverage?
Yeah, I mean, the undecided voters are sort of the great white whale of political reporting, because we live in such a kind of polarized country right now that you can generally assume that if you're a Republican, you're voting for the Republican. If you're a Democrat, you're voting for the Democrat. And even independents, when you really talk to them, sometimes they decide that they're independents because they don't want to officially join a party, but they almost always vote for one party or another. They're not really, party switchers. So from a reporting standpoint, I mean, one of the tools that I do, this is not really a polling thing, but one of the tools that I have is I just keep a file. I mean, I keep a file of, all of the voters that I've ever talked to in the last 4 presidential elections. And, I just go back to anytime I find somebody who seems like a true undecided, I just keep going back to them, in my reporting, and just try to figure, call them up every couple months and just see, what are you thinking? Who do you like? Who do you not like? And you can, I have a true file of Obama, Trump voters. They do exist. So, just in reporting, I think that's one thing you can do. I mean, Emily, do you want to talk about what that looks like in terms of how we account for them in polling?
Yeah. There is not just one definition of who is an undecided voter. The way that different polls handle this in terms of how far you press people to lean one way or the other is really important. One thing that is interesting is that undecided voters in many ways look a lot like people who might not be voters. If you look at a poll of undecided voters, it often includes a lot of people who are pretty disengaged. So and that's not to say, and I think some people take this a little bit too far, that undecided voters who will vote don't exist. They do. But I do think that it's important to know that when you see a poll that says 10% of voters are undecided, that is probably not true. Probably a pretty good chunk of those people are not going to vote. And what you're actually looking at is maybe something half the size of that. It's another of those, we don't know for certain, at least until after Election Day, and possibly not even with precision after that. But it is an important thing to know about when we're talking about undecided voters and when we're looking at that block of people in a poll, that just know that not all of those people are swing voters who could go either way. They might just stay home. And here's the cat.
Great. Well, thank you so much. If it's okay, I just want to, it is 3 o'clock Eastern. I want to ask you one quick final question before we sign off for the day. For each of you, if there's one thing based on, from your vantage points, that reporters should be covering from now until Election Day, what would that thing be?
I just want to know how people are choosing to vote, what method they're choosing to vote, and whether that is changing in these last couple of weeks, for any variety of reasons. But I just think that's so much of the story of this election is not just going to be who wins, but how people are voting and whether they're able to do that.
I would add one thing to that, which is the confidence in the process, and it's related to those. It's related to confidence in vote by mail and in vote on Election Day and in the vote count. But it sort of feels like we're at a sort of pivotal moment in our democracy in some ways, and that is a big part of the story itself. It's simply our confidence in the way that our system works.